I was thinking about how to introduce this session, and considering it's Google, I thought about my first encounter with Google, which was the year I qualified in 1998, which is quite a long time ago. God, that is a long time ago. And I remember peculiarly, because I was moonlighting for a person called Douglas Adams. Do you remember the author, now late Douglas Adams, the guy who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? He was designing the first wiki, the first Wikipedia. It was called The Hitchhiker's Guide Online, H2G2. And little old Jack, as well as being a junior doctor, was also moonlighting for him building H2G2 secretly. No one ever knew. And I remember doing my first Google search with Douglas sitting next to me and realizing that my entire profession was going to change. I remembered the times where if we wanted to check a reference, we'd have to climb up lots of ladders in peculiar old libraries on Gower Street to check that particular issue of The Lancet and then flick through to a page and so forth, and eventually prove that what we'd written in a reference was real. And there, that happens everywhere now. In fact, it happens instantly. And you can just imagine how the world has changed. But that's just to do with access to information. That's not to do with actually creating new knowledge and new science with artificial intelligence and data, which is where it's very, very rapidly turned. And to explore this particular company and its associated work in AI is a fellow colleague, a surgeon, who is a pioneer now, not just in his work in academia and medicine, but at Google, where he is leading the health efforts with DeepMind, that's now Google Health, I think, kind of recently merged. Dr. Karthikesalingam is like myself, a medic working both in the NHS and also working at the cutting edge of tech, and I think a brilliant example of people who thought once upon a time that all we would do is be sitting in front of patients or chopping bits of people's bodies up and sewing them back again, are now doing very, very, very different things to what physicians and surgeons did for the last 2,800 years, or however long it's been since we first stuck things into people, whether they liked it or not. Anyway, so I would love us if we could give a little round of applause to Alan as he comes on stage, and we're going to have a good old chinwag about this new world. Alan, I've given a little intro to you, but perhaps you can colour that with the truth about how you got to being where you are, both clinically and also at Google.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. Yeah, as you say, I'm an NHS clinician, and I also work at Google. All of this started for me from research, though. As a vascular surgery specialist, my principal interest was always in, and still is, in patient safety. And vascular surgery in particular is one of those areas in medicine where the ability to look back at your practice and learn from previous mistakes, as well as look at all of what's going on and try and understand better the practice of medicine, is really important. And so most vascular surgeons are quite interested in research, and I was no exception to that, and was really fortunate in the NHS to have had some great mentors. So for me personally, it began really with my own PhD, and then as a lecturer in London supervising other people. And one of the problems with all of this work was that I realized, we were doing things by hand ourselves that were really quite painful in order to better analyze and understand how we were looking after our patients. And after spending hours in dark rooms tracing round blood vessels on CT scans, I think, like any kind of frustrated academic, I started wondering how it might be possible to do these things better. And I think in academic medicine in particular, many of our great breakthroughs come when we meet with and work alongside people from really different backgrounds, different specialties. And in my case, it was computer science and really deep learning. And I was fortunate to meet with and work with some really amazing academics from DeepMind early in my career. And when I got into that, I realized quite quickly that this is quite a powerful technology, deep learning and artificial intelligence, with real general applications far beyond healthcare for science as a tool for scientific discovery. Certainly within healthcare, far beyond just vascular surgery. And so the opportunity to sort of further that work and work with brilliant computer scientists, mathematicians, machine learning experts firsthand was too good to pass up, and try and turn all of that brain power towards clinically relevant work and making life better for our patients.
I was just going to ask the audience, are there any medics here who, any doctors? I haven't got any doctors in the audience. I was going to say, though, that when I made that move from deciding that a full-time career in medicine wasn't right for me, being, a good Jewish boy from Golders Green, my mother was really not very happy at all. Of course, now that's quite different. How do your colleagues what's the perception of you as a physician now working at one of the biggest tech giants in the world? Is it a positive vibe, or how are people responding? Because for me, it was pretty grim for about 10 years.
What do my colleagues think of me? I think it's positive. In my personal case, there's another thing in the NHS called the NIHR, or the National Institute for Health Research, which was actually started by England's former Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davies, who was also at Imperial, which is where I work. And so I've always been very fortunate in that I had, throughout my training, formal academic time and academic training. So I was always being trained as a surgeon scientist, with half of my time spent officially doing medical research and half of my time in clinical practice. And it was a fairly gradual transition for me. I mean, it began with my academic time being spent doing more of this sort of work that looks like deep learning and artificial intelligence and its applications to medicine. And at the time, and still, places like DeepMind and Google have got very strong research departments. And so it was a very natural thing, I think, to be able to pursue some of those research interests with institutions of excellence. And there's obviously important things about keeping your time at private companies completely separate from your time in your NHS capacity. But so long as that is maintained with appropriate governance, I think the reception is quite positive. And as you mentioned, I think these days now, the NHS in particular has got very good at training clinical staff in a variety of different kind of complementary skills, technology being one of them. Yeah,
and there's other programs for anyone that's watching this who's interested in clinical practice as a career, but also technology and how that is perhaps a parallel or a complementary part of things. That there are great programs now supporting folk rather than them being called mavericks and dangerous to the public as it was in the beginning. Alan, I wanted to talk to you a little bit first, because I know everyone's been talking about it and we won't talk for long about it, but clearly Google was involved in pandemic response. What was your take of its responsibility, role, and good sides and bad sides from what you saw of how tech was involved in the UK response, at least, let's say, and then we go further afield?
Yeah, I think for me, obviously it's been a very challenging year or two for all of us, especially in those of us who actually work in the healthcare system, the healthcare provision. But if we sort of zoom out from the hospital, one of the most difficult things, I think, in the UK and around the world has been, as a society, having to confront this, frankly, what was quite frightening new virus, with all sorts of social implications. And I think information, and trusted information from independent authorities with expertise, can be a very empowering resource. And so one of the things Google and other tech companies have really made concerted efforts towards is exactly that. So as an example, Google quite early on in this pandemic partnered with the World Health Organization. Some of those information resources, for example, on YouTube, what are called knowledge panels on YouTube, which reflect who authorized kind of guidance and are tailored to each location. They've served over 400 billion impressions now. And I think that sort of thing, really accurate, trusted information that empowers people to make their own better health decisions, is a really important part of public health and of the public feeling less frightened, more empowered, more able to sort of access resources and expertise in their area. Similarly, around the world now, tens of thousands of testing sites, are displayed accurately on maps, again in partnership with trusted health authorities around the world. So that's at the sort of level of information. I think another thing is when confronting this new and quite scary disease has been the medical research response around the world has been incredible. And again, Google and other tech companies have really tried to contribute to that in ways that accelerate the humanity's response to this unforeseen challenge. Lots of examples. One would be, for example, just here at DeepMind, some of the work that was done around protein folding and modeling. DeepMind sort of worked with scientists in the field to apply that to the coronavirus, and again open sourced their results so that others could build upon it. Similarly, Google found ways to de-identify and render anonymized these data about the ways that social distancing policies were impacting, for example, how many people were in different types of locations. So you can imagine how many people were in shopping districts, or how many people were in parks, how many people were in places of work and things like that. And you'll have seen those graphs from what are now called community mobility reports that any of us can go onto. We can go into the Google website, type in our postcode, and we'll get these anonymized information about the change compared to several weeks ago of how many more people might be in areas of shopping or areas of retail or taking public transport compared to previously. And that kind of thing has again been very empowering and important for scientists around the world, governments, individual citizens, trying to understand what's going on in society around me, and how are we coping as a society with combating this.
Yeah, I kind of think, what would it have been like if this happened in 1998? I mean, it would have been a very different world, would it not? Obviously, notwithstanding things like the development of mRNA technologies and various other things, but just people being able to find out stuff. It wasn't coming from government sources at first. It was coming from people who could, search stuff and see it visualized. Interesting, yeah. I'm purposefully going to move away from COVID because we've heard a lot of talks about that and how tech has helped. I want to talk a little bit more about your role now at DeepMind, at Google Health, and some of the other things where you see the role of AI and data really now stepping up in, because we've got a lot of catch up to do as well, by the way, post this pandemic. There's I think is it that we've regressed 8 years in cancer stats and performance in the last year and a half, which is pretty miserable. And we've got over 5 million people waiting for stuff now, which is the longest waiting list I think we've ever had in NHS history. So I'd love to get your insight and maybe some of the stuff which we haven't yet heard about, which is exciting from your work.
Yeah, of course. I think deep learning in particular, of all the fields of artificial intelligence, I think one of the things that's most powerful about it is the ability for computers to learn from experience as opposed to handcrafted instructions. And one of the fields in everyday life outside of medicine where this has been really powerful has been in computer vision, computers that can see and perceive the world around us, has been very powerful in all sorts of settings. Most prosaically, just if you open a sort of Photos app and you want to find your dog, you can just type in dog and it'll pull up all the dogs in your photo album without you having to sort of explain to it that that's your particular pet. But in the context of medicine and healthcare, I think one of the really interesting applications of that is in medical imaging. So instead of finding a dog in a field or a cat in a field, you could find a breast cancer in a mammogram. And there's a lot more to building those sorts of deep learning models and then figuring out how to turn them into trusted, safe tools that could actually be used in clinical practice. There's an awful lot of steps that go into that, and doing that sort of responsibly and safely is quite a kind of big scientific, regulatory, multidisciplinary endeavor. But that's the sort of work we're doing in my team at Google, in what we call the Health AI team at Google. So as an example, we worked with researchers in the United States, but also here in the UK at Cancer Research UK, in developing, a couple of years ago now, an initial deep learning model based on some de-identified mammograms, where we trained these deep learning models to identify breast cancer in screening mammograms, the sort that are routinely collected. Women go every 3 years for screening. And that's a very exciting and important initial step, which we published in the journal Nature. And now what we're doing is looking at the next phases that you need to go through to safely figure out how to bring that sort of promising technology, where on the one hand you could say, in theory, in a laboratory setting, it's possible to train a deep learning model to identify breast cancer with the same accuracy as an expert. But then building that into medical device software that could actually be used at the bedside safely is what we're working on now, and is a much longer and more complex piece of work.
So you feel as if we've come a long way with the algorithms, but now the task is to get people to use it with decent interface and systems that plug into big old hospital systems, etc. Is that the challenge? I think those are two of the challenges. I think even before that, there are other challenges about, for example, these deep learning systems are principally pattern recognizing tools, and one of the things you can guarantee in medical practice is that there will always be a sort of long tail of rare and unusual things that happen. And so you have to build software that's safe and that can anticipate and have good safeguards against all of these things. One example could be in the setting of screening mammography. Sometimes it can be quite painful to acquire a mammogram, and the image can be blurred or poor quality. And so that, these are very basic things that you have to be able to anticipate. Beyond that, there are also issues about generalization of these systems. So they may have originally been trained and tested in specific populations, and you need to then do further responsible machine learning development and science to show that these kind of systems can perform fairly and can generalize and reproduce their performance in different settings, different populations around the world, different devices and so on. And there's then these really important socio-technical steps that you're referring to as well, about really deeply understanding the clinicians who are using these tools and what they actually need from the system, and making sure that the user interface, the user experience, things like that can really support all of those needs. And doing that in close partnership with clinicians, patients, also means publishing all of those steps and being transparent about it, so that ultimately clinicians can assess the safety and cost effectiveness, clinical effectiveness of these tools. I mean, you know this already, but that's ultimately what drives adoption of things in healthcare, is the knowledge that they're robust, they're safe, and they are actually beneficial. I was lucky enough to get an electric car recently, which means that I don't press the brake pedal as much. It's a weird thing. And I found myself not pressing the brake pedal enough. When you come up to a car that's slowed down in front of you, you don't automatically switch to the other pedal in front of you because you're expecting the regenerative braking to work. I know I'm trying to make this analogy work, but what I'm trying to get to is that sometimes breakthroughs in technology can assist someone to the point where they're de-skilling them. And I wanted to get your feeling on that, because, radiologists up until now generally relied on their own visual cortex and various other bits of their brain, as opposed to an artificial brain somewhere to help them make decisions. What's your view on this sort of potential of being de-skilled if you're not doing enough repetitive tasks?
So firstly, I think that's a very important thing to think about, is just in general, even if we take it away from technology, there is a really important thing about professional skills maintenance, volume of work, quality of work, reflective practice. One thing we're very lucky with, particularly in the UK, but also around the world in the medical profession, is there's already very good systems and safeguards for people revalidating, maintaining their skill set. We talked about mammography earlier. This is a sort of thing which is very robustly monitored, there's training, there's quality assurance, there's the monitoring of these things like cancer detection rate or recall rate for accredited readers in the National Breast Screening Programme. So that kind of thing is independent of technology and is just incredibly important.
But what happens if it gets shown that actually I'm not as good as the machine? So at some point, I'm not going to be allowed to do manual reading because I'm not as good as the machine, which is a very real thing. You know, we already know the performance of most cases of certain things that you can pick up visually is going to be, like my electric car will probably drive down the motorway better than me, certainly at 2 o'clock in the morning already, when on a rainy day. When that point happens where best practice is actually not human, and yet those edge cases still exist where you need human eyes to look at it, that's an interesting turning point where skills will need to be. I mean, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, so again, I mean, this is going to be a long answer. But so the next thing I would say is artificial intelligence and deep learning is a new type of technology for tools that assist radiologists. But interestingly, again, in mammography as an example, we've had over sort of 15 years of various types of computer-assisted detection tools that have been developed that predate deep learning. And indeed, some of them are quite rare in the UK, for example, because they weren't particularly shown to be associated with better outcomes for patients. And in the UK, we have this gold standard system of 2 different readers interpreting an image. But one of the really interesting things about deep learning tools, I think, as you said, is this potential that the accuracy for the final task, so rather than these previous tools which just marked suspicious areas on an image and then might make radiologists doubt their opinion or overcall things, deep learning tools might actually solve some of those problems, potentially, by very accurately marking lesions that could be cancerous. So that then definitely raises this question of automation bias or over-reliance on these systems. And I think the first thing to say is that such software is very heavily regulated, and appropriately so. And the first wave of these systems, the ones that we're seeing be submitted to regulators now, are not, to my knowledge, are not being regulated as Class 3 devices, which is to say a device that could perform the task alone. They're almost all being regulated as Class 2 devices, which is tools to assist clinical decision support. It's a tool to assist a radiologist. So that takes away, I think, for now, this worry about autonomy and autonomous systems, because the technology isn't there. On the other hand, though, even these assistive tools, you're quite right to highlight that the nature of that interaction is actually quite an interesting and important area to study deeply. And in studies to date, both over-reliance on these systems has been reported, as has skepticism. And really, I think one of the interesting areas that the field is moving towards is the understanding of complementarity. In other words, between a user of such a system and the system itself, when is it the case that the system is highly confident with a confidence rating that's calibrated and evidence-based? And how can that information be shared with the user so that they have an actionable strategy of collaborating with this tool that they're using? Because it might actually be helpful to be swayed by a circle that's placed on a lesion if that circle that's been placed on it and the mark saying, this is potentially cancerous, if that's highly reliable, then that could be a very useful signal. On the other hand, if it's a very ambiguous image for the machine and it's not quite sure, that's also important information to convey, because then in those kinds of cases, it's probably important to be appropriately skeptical. And so I think, again, when we were talking earlier about this difference between sort of offline proof of principle studies in retrospective settings towards careful, calibrated understanding of how these things can be built into useful tools that benefit patients, I suspect that those kind of clinician AI interaction studies and responsible development of those is going to be really important, because it's likely to be the case that, as you say, there will always be cases in which experienced radiologists, particularly groups of experienced radiologists, may need to make much more nuanced decisions than certainly deep learning software as it currently is in medicine will be capable of doing.
I mean, there's the acronym, isn't there? VOMIT, Victims of Medical Imaging Technology. I think that's the official thing, where it's those victims are the ones who have expensive, dangerous needles stuck into bits of their body once they have sort of a random asymptomatic full body MRI or something for cancer detection. And of course, everyone's got 5 or 6 funny looking things in their body, and we all have to stick needles in them all of a sudden. So the hospital that's provided that wonderful scan then gets to stick needles in people, but the problem is people get hurt, and someone's got to pay for that, and on a financial level, but of course it has a human cost as well. And I'm wondering if any of the work that you're doing is helping to get onto the early detection, to improve the early detection efforts that we're trying to make, because I still think we think that most of the hard to treat cancers are not going to be cured in the next 10, 20 years, but earlier detection might help us cure them surgically. But is there any work that you're doing on ultra early detection and being able to differentiate the things that we need to sort of explore or can just leave or maybe wait for 6 months? Are you working on any of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another really interesting area of application of deep learning, probably more in the sort of research setting than clinical practice setting. I think when it comes to things like sort of cancer screening, there are modified Wilson. There are these criteria called Wilson-Jungner criteria about should you screen just because you can take a medical image of someone? Should you? Is that actually going to help this person? And again, for the time being, these screening programs are based on really robust evidence and careful rationale for whether or not people should go for a screening assessment. And most deep learning technology in cancer screening today is as a tool inside that. So it doesn't sort of aim to increase the total amount of screening that's going on or widen that. On the other hand, though, in quite different settings, I think these tools can be very helpful for research programs that try and do earlier detection or understand more about diseases. So one example of that we're working on is with our colleagues in Moorfields Eye Hospital, where we've, again, for a few years been doing some work together around the earlier identification of the signs of macular degeneration in the eye. So AMD, or macular degeneration, is the most common cause of blindness in the Western world, or preventable sight loss in the West. And today, if you get what's called wet AMD in one eye, then you quite quickly need treatment for that. And as a patient, the thing that is quite concerning then is that you're reliant upon your other eye for your stable vision while that eye is being sorted out. And many people would like to know what kind of risk they're at in what's called the fellow eye, so the eye that didn't present with the first problem. And interestingly, when you go for your assessment, the 3D eye scanning machine, which is called an OCT machine, will image both of your eyes at the same time. So we're working with researchers at Moorfields to look at those images of both eyes together and see whether deep learning systems can, by looking at the tissues in the other eye, understand better someone's risk of developing wet AMD, so the more urgent form of AMD happening in the other eye. And the reason that sort of work is important is that there are clever people around the world trying to develop therapies or see whether existing therapies might help. And rather than treating this disease after it's occurred, there's trials and so on going on to see whether you could get ahead of that and prevent it from happening. But such trials would be better done if they were sort of calibrated to people's risk. So the ideal such trial is to give a potentially helpful treatment in someone who's actually at really high risk rather than in absolutely everyone.
We have to move on to questions in a minute. 40 odd years ago, there wasn't really much going on. Certainly, you wouldn't have a computer at a doctor's surgery, really. You might have a typewriter or a fax machine. 20 years ago was when I did that Google search and realized things were going to change. Today, we're hearing about all this great stuff in cancer work, in protein folding, drug discovery, dissemination of information. maybe suppression of misinformation even. That's another sensitive topic for another time. I know that's not what we've got time for now. What's my job going to... What do I tell my mum in 20 years' time? God willing, she's still around. What's my job going to look like?
I think in an ideal world, your job will be more joyful. And technology, I think, is really a tool. When it's designed best, it can be a tool for giving doctors and patients back the gift of time. I think in an ideal world, as patients, we have faster access to really trusted, authoritative information. Moments when we're quite vulnerable, really, and we need help, that we can get useful information and easily. And then the second thing is that as doctors, we have the gift of time back to spend with our patients. I think one of the things when technology goes wrong in healthcare is when it gets in between the doctor and the patient. And I think there are many sort of repetitive tasks that we do as physicians that if they can be assisted by technology a bit better, then we can spend more time kind of making these shared decisions with our patients that really improve experience. So I think hopefully your job will be similar, but just
more joyful.
Yeah,
I love
more
that.
joyful.
You heard it first here, everybody. My job's going to be more joyful in 20. I'm going to hold you to that. I must admit, I know airplanes fly themselves mostly now, but when it gets bumpy, I love it when a human being says, "Don't worry, Jack," or "Don't worry. It's going to get a bit bumpy for a few minutes, but it will be okay." I love that human to human time. And thank you very much. We're gonna move on to some questions. Let's start with the audience. Gentleman, very bright lights. Gentleman over there. AI is easy, AV is hard.
On the NHS to benefit from these AI algorithms.
So in case no one heard that, it's essentially what's the path to from artificial intelligence research to sort of mass rolled out national scale health system benefit?
So I think the path to kind of clinical translation for these technologies, it's usually involves firstly proving their safety as medical devices. So when we think of medical devices, we normally think about hardware, but actually both in the UK, Europe and the US now, software too can be a medical device, and so that's an important process that takes some time to develop these things carefully and safely. The second thing then is figuring out how such devices can actually be used, because I think as Jack was alluding to earlier, AI-enabled workflows are going to be slightly different to the same workflow without this technology. And again, that's something that we believe shouldn't be rushed. It takes time and it needs studies. I would say this as a researcher, but it does, and those studies are led by clinical experts. And so that's the kind of work we're doing and will continue to do, and we publish and share those findings. And those help you build tools in clinical pathways that really are safe and are beneficial. And then after that, the next step is evidence generation, health economic outcomes research that actually proves out whether or not these technologies improve patient experience, staff experience, clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and so on. And interestingly, the other thing, of course, is Google's just one such technology provider. Over 100 deep learning technology softwares have been approved by either the FDA or been CE marked in the past couple of years alone. And so there's a lot of this kind of work that's going to be happening, being published, being led by clinician experts around the world in the next few years. And it's only sort of the summation of all of that. Just like with the adoption of any technology into the NHS, we have really good guidance from the colleges, expert bodies, specialist associations, and organizations like NICE that then help understand how these kinds of technologies can be commissioned, can be used and deployed. And usually, again, they start small, again, with evidence wrapped around them before you see national uptake. At least that's the way these kind of things usually work in the UK.
We won't be seeing robots replacing your GP just yet, but we're on the path. got a couple of questions still in the audience, and then we'll try to make the questions and the answers quick because we've got a few questions also online. So please.
First of all, thanks for the great talk. Really interesting. I'm at a musculoskeletal health startup. We use computer vision we have a preventative product that will assess you and try and prevent issues, and then an in-clinic product that will augment the efforts of physios and surgeons. I'm really curious, are there any burning questions you're answering in the musculoskeletal space, or is there any research that you're working on in that domain? You mentioned some other great exciting areas. I know you can't do them all, but that's my curious question.
Not personally, and not in our team personally. Most of our work has been around slightly other areas, but obviously I know there's lots of great work in that field too.
Okay, cool,
Yeah.
thanks.
A future hole to fill.
So you spoke quite a lot about sort of the end goal for how machine learning can be used and deep learning can be used to sort of read scans and do that kind of thing. But I was wondering how you think it's best for us to manage the transfer between experts doing the majority of the work there to potentially AI doing the majority and the human just sort of overlooking it? Or do you think that will never happen?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's sort of similar to the previous answer, really. I think there's quite a big assumption in that, and unpacking that for every different, I mean, we've only talked about imaging so far, but unpacking that for every different clinical application is, again, really quite different, from dermatology to digital pathology to all the different branches of radiology. There's probably a different answer to each of those questions. And so to me, it comes down to, again, clinicians, patients in those specialties, proving out different pathways for AI-enabled care slowly. And I think it's quite a boring answer, but I think it will take time. I don't think innovation in healthcare can necessarily happen that quickly when you're talking about these kind of profound socio-technical changes. It usually is something that takes quite a few years. And so I don't have a single answer. It would depend on the application, the problem, and the specialty.
Unfortunately for those who have asked questions online, we have run out of time, which is a shame. But I think it is safe to say that it was a privilege to have Alan talk to us about what is going on both in general in AI and medicine and also specific work at Google. I personally am particularly grateful to all the tech companies for their support during what was a very rocky 18 months. And I thoroughly look forward to being here in 20 years' time with a bigger smile on my face and more time on my hands. Thank you very much, Alan.
Thanks very much.